Hi students, welcome to the editorial analysis of Vijayata IAS Academy. In this video, we are taking an editorial from the Hindu newspaper. Entire world is in shock due to war between Russia and Ukraine. So Russia declared war on Ukraine on record. Entire world is in shock. Now it is going to create a lot of ripple effects across the globe. In that context, Hindu newspaper also has given an editorial on this issue. Overall, if we summarize the context or contents of this editorial, it is talking about the ripple effects of the war and sanctions against Russia. What is the central reason behind this war and how war can be ended? So these are the broad themes of this editorial. Let us start then. Russia's unjustifiable incursion. So this is the first phrase which editorial used. Russia's unjustifiable incursion. So it is talking about unjustifiable. So war cannot be justified on any ground. So this is the position taken by editorial. Into Ukraine, following weeks of military troop buildup on their shared border has drastically raised tensions in the region with broader ripple effects across the world, particularly for NATO countries. This war will have ripple effects on the world itself, particularly for NATO countries. NATO countries are located just neighboring Ukraine. Now, whatever crisis, for example, any war creates violence, it leads to catastrophic damage to life and property, and indirectly it leads to refugee crisis. Now, people from Ukraine move outside their borders and they enter into the neighboring countries. So neighboring countries will have to face the burden of this war. So it will have ripple effects on the world. And now in this part of the globe, if problem in this part of the world arises, then it is going to indirectly affect every part of the globe. So this is what editorial is talking. Report said that several Ukraine cities, including capital Kyiv, came under attack even as the United Nations Security Council held an emergency meeting to stop the invasion. While UNSC held a meeting to stop the invasion, still many cities in Ukraine country are under attack. So this is the main issue, and now responding to this situation, already different countries imposed sanctions on Russia. US President Joe Biden and NATO and European Commission leadership vowed to impose severe sanctions on Russia. Already started imposing sanctions. Now more sanctions are going to be imposed on Russia. This round of sanctions will overlay prior economic penalties imposed on Russian entities and individuals. So far, on individuals and Russian entities like corporations, economic penalties are imposed. Now it is going to have sanctions on broader level, broader economic level as well, like Russian banks from financial system, cutting off top Russian bank from financial system, halting technology exports, and directly targeting the Russian president. Now here you can see the term financial system, banks from the financial system, and halting technology exports. Russia's main area of revenues are coming from, one is oil reserves and another one is exports of technology related products, particularly with respect to defense products. Even India also imports a lot of defense related products from Russia. Now if these sanctions are going to be imposed on Russia, now they are going to target the core of their economic base. So banks from financial system, now it will have impact on other countries as well. For example, India, it will push India to a difficult situation where we need S-400 missile system, for example, to import from Russia. But now Russia cannot export, also India cannot import. And also the Russian banks from financial system, if the banking system is cut off, India cannot pay through banking system. Now it is, if we have relations with Russia, that sanctions will also, India also will attract those sanctions. So that is why this situation now is going to have ripple effects across the globe. Now what Russia wants exactly? Russia wants answers regarding NATO. Unless answers coming from NATO member group and USA regarding NATO, this war is not going to be ended. This is what editorial is highlighting. Moscow hardly be surprised at this backlash. That means Moscow is not going to be surprised by these sanctions, for it has shown little sympathy towards the idea of engaging diplomatically on Ukraine question. So far, so many diplomatic efforts were going on even before the beginning of this war. Already, Russia started building up army neighboring countries of Ukraine, but still, while diplomacy was going on, Russia invaded or Russia attacked Ukraine. So far, Moscow can hardly be surprised with this backlash. It has shown little sympathy towards the idea of engaging diplomatically on Ukraine issue. Ever since Russia began amassing troops on Ukraine borders, the US, NATO, Europe have sought to press for diplomatic solutions. Ever since Russia building up its military bases or military movement troops on the borders of Ukraine, already diplomatic solutions they tried. This includes direct US-Russia negotiations. French president also met Mr. Putin. Still, diplomacy did not work. So it is showing that the gravity of the situation is greater. Unless answers regarding NATO are answered to Putin or Russia, this war is not going to be ended. It is unlikely that prospects of escalating violence and devastating toll on human life and property in Ukraine can be ruled out until Mr. Putin's broader question on NATO are answered. So this is the core aspect or the core reason. NATO is enhancing or increasing its sphere of influence towards the Russian side. Russia is feeling insecure because of this NATO expansion. Now, Ukraine also wanted to join NATO. This is where it triggered. Russia do not want to allow Ukraine to be part of NATO. Once Ukraine becomes part of NATO membership, then directly Russia comes under threat of NATO. This, if you can see, NATO expansion ever since 1997. Earlier, this part was USSR, part of USSR. During Cold War time, Cold War started after the Second World War. Entire world was divided into two parts. One is capitalist, another one is communist bloc. Communist bloc was led by USSR. Here, main leader was Russia and surprisingly Ukraine. So it is capitalist bloc was led by USA. Once Ukraine was against USA. Russia was against USA during Cold War, USSR. Now, after Cold War ended in 1991, Cold War ended. Now, unipolar war emerged. Unipolar means single polar, no two blocks in the world politics. Now, entire world led by USA emerged. New world order emerged in 1991. After 1991, now these Eastern European countries which were once part of USSR bloc, these were part of USSR, they were against NATO, against capitalist bloc, against USA once. Now due to their economic condition, financial crisis, now they were pushed out of USSR. One of the reasons for Cold War, one of the reasons for disintegration of USSR, after 1991, USSR disintegrated into 15 republics. These are some of the republics that came out of USSR. Due to financial crisis, this situation forced them to go out of USSR. Now, in order to enhance their economic condition, they moved gradually towards west side. Now, some of the countries directly joined NATO as well. NATO was a security alliance against communist bloc. So, NATO was the military alliance of capitalist bloc against communist bloc, that is USSR and Russia in particular. Russia or USSR also responded against NATO by creating its own security arrangement, that is Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact was created, so it was like NATO versus Warsaw. After 1991, Warsaw Pact it became irrelevant. Now it is no more functional, but NATO continued to function after 1991. And this NATO, instead of dissolving, because there is no communist bloc, no need to have a military alliance against communist bloc, But still NATO continued to be relevant, and not only to be relevant but even expanded to its previous USSR countries. Now this is where the threat, Russia felt a threat regarding NATO. And you can see this color, these are the expansion after 1997. NATO expanded to these areas. Now Ukraine is the major country which was left out of NATO. Now recently, for the last 1 decade, there were opinions of in Ukraine political circles also to join with NATO and be closer towards western part of the world so that it can gain financially and it can improve its economic strength. This is where Russia felt that once Ukraine become part of NATO, then it comes directly, entire Russian border directly comes under threat from NATO. So this is the heart of this issue. Core issue of the conflict is NATO. At the heart of his fears means Mr. Putin's fears, is the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO and NATO troops potentially stationed at the border with Russia. Once it stayed at the border of Russia, then it always creates tensions for Russian state. NATO's historical record of its penchant for expansionism has likely fueled such insecurities. So editorial is highlighting that this NATO's historical record, NATO always aimed to expand its bases. Now this has fueled the insecurities in the Russian state. After the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, now whatever I have explained you, after the dissolution of former Soviet Union, the Eastern European Military Alliance, this is, you can read, Warsaw Pact. NATO and Russia in 1997 signed the Founding Act. Here this one phrase, Founding Act, on mutual relations, cooperation and security. This Founding Act means now both sides agreed together not to threaten each other. So peaceful coexistence was the principle of this Founding Act. So military bases, nuclear arsenal, so such kind of issues are resolved through this Founding Act, and the main fundamental aim of this act or negotiation is not to threaten the either side with arms and nuclear arsenal. Disregarding this spirit, NATO quietly underwent 5 rounds of enlargement during 90s, pulling former Soviet Union countries into its orbit. Former Soviet Union countries, once these countries were part of USSR, once they were against NATO, against USA, but due to financial crisis they were forced to go out of USSR and join with NATO and Western European bloc. Cooperative exchanges, communication hotlines and Cold War fail-safes such as arms control verification have fallen by the wayside. So here Cold War fail-safes means safeguards against each other, so that no country will attack the other country without having proper communication. So this cooperative exchanges and communication hotline, so that always whenever there is a situation of armed conflict, before entering into the armed conflict, problem can be identified and can be solved diplomatically. All these mechanisms failed, and all these mechanisms became irrelevant after NATO's expansion slowly, particularly after annexation of Crimea in 2014. These mechanisms became weak. Now there is no mechanism to safeguard against each other. Now mutual distrust increased. Now this is became the heart of the issue, and this is the core reason why Russia took this drastic step. However, in the first phrase itself, article is saying that Russia's actions cannot be justified. So even though Russia is having legitimate security reasons, legitimate insecurity is there, it has its own legitimate reasons, but still sending troops to another sovereign country cannot be justified. It may be the case that owing to Mr. Putin's failure to develop Russia into an economic powerhouse that naturally attracted neighboring countries and international capital to itself, partly explains Moscow's deflection of attention to strategic question relating to NATO and Russia's territorial integrity. Editorial is saying that It is partly due to the failure of Russia not able to show the economic progress where it naturally attracts former Soviet republics towards Russia. If Russia becomes economic stronghouse or economic powerhouse, naturally these eastern erstwhile USSR members also would have attracted towards Russia, and this kind of situation would not have arisen. But now, as Russia is not a strong economic powerhouse comparing with the Western countries and USA, maybe this is the reason Russia wants to deflect its attention internally, domestically, and so that it can show the national security as a threat, and it can pull or it can rally the domestic constituencies towards the national security issue. So instead of highlighting the failure of Russia to develop itself, it is turning its attention towards the national integrity issues like expansion of NATO and its security reasons. Conclusion is editorial is saying, unless Western nations give assurances to Mr. Putin that NATO will not seek to relentlessly expand its footprint eastwards, Moscow will have little incentive to return to the negotiation table. Mr. Putin and Russia always maintains that Ukraine should not join NATO, and there should be a mechanism for this expansion of NATO as well. But Russia and Mr. Putin must realize that war is not the means to peace and security. So this is already the editorial started by saying his actions cannot be justified and ending by saying that war cannot be a solution for peace and security. Russia wants peace and security. This is the reason why it always say NATO should not be expanded. Now by attacking another sovereign country, now peace and security cannot be achieved. So this is what editorial is saying. Reason and one conclusion saying are the main solution for ending war is Western nations should give assurance to Mr. Putin and Russia that NATO will not seek expansion and its footprint eastwards. So this is the main crux of Hindu editorial. Thank you.